Hi everyone, my name is Taylor Curl and I am a proud member of the 20 under 35 cohort, one of the 20 people under 35 who the industry has named as a future leader. We are proud, along with SES, to be a sponsor of this new special series of the Better Satellite World called Space for All. And now here is the host of our series, Lou Zaccarella.
Okay, you've just heard from the future. Now, let's get into the present because this is the Better Satellite World, the podcast of Space and Satellite Professionals International. I'm Lou Zaccarella. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the next episode of our series, Space for All. Today, we take on an aspect of Space for All that emerged during the spring and summer of 2020. The death of George Floyd while in police custody in the city of Minneapolis here in America triggered a physical and psychological uprising that found its way into the space and satellite industry as it has others. Space News Magazine in July assigned writers Debra Werner and Caleb Henry to report on how the space sector was responding to this incident, which had by then roiled cities around the world and sparked massive protests, violence, and racial tensions which hover over society still. Their reporting began by noting that in July 1969, civil rights protesters were marching outside the Kennedy Space Center 24 hours before Apollo 11 launched for the moon. They noted that 51 years later, the first flight of astronauts from U.S. soil in 9 years aboard a SpaceX Dragon occurred amidst the reaction to this incident. So what has changed in our industry? Anything? Well, we're going to ask the writers of that piece. But first, Space for All is sponsored by SES and the 20 under 35 cohort. SES is a satellite and terrestrial telecommunications network provider headquartered in Luxembourg. It supplies connectivity everywhere to broadcasters, internet service providers, network operators, governments, and institutions. SES says, let us take your story anywhere. The 20 under 35 cohort are 20 young executives under 35 years of age in the space and satellite industry who the industry named the most promising people on the planet this past October. SES is matching their contribution to this series. The Better Satellite World podcast is also supported by the corporate partners of SSPI, Eutelsat, EchoStar Hughes, Peraton, and Access Intelligence, content with context. Additional support comes from the 3,000 professional members of SSPI and our chapters around the world, including our UK and Isle of Man chapters, hosts of the 2020 Better Satellite World Awards. Well, Deborah Werner is a respected correspondent for the space and aerospace industries. She has, among other things, been a stringer for Time magazine and a reporter for Commercial Aviation News and Defense News, where she was the recipient of the Ford Prize for distinguished reporting on national defense. Caleb Henry is a journalist who served as an assistant editor at Access Intelligence and via satellite, and moved to Space News in 2016, where he became a distinguished staff writer. Last month, he left to become a senior analyst at Quilty Analytics in Washington, D.C. And together, they produced this article, the best and first of its kind for our industry. And I welcome them both here today. Caleb, Deborah, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to join you today.
Good to be with you.
Well, it's great to hear both your voices, and congratulations on the piece. First question to Caleb and Deborah. Caleb, you first, and then Deborah, you can join in. How did this article actually come about? What was the context for it? Did you guys decide, or was it an editorial assignment?
Sure. So this article started basically as an idea of mine. I had been toying around with how to approach the topic of inclusivity and diversity within the space industry during the summertime, and that was before the death or killing of George Floyd. But we were having this conversation, and then as current events, I guess caught up with or overtook this sort of editorial ideation process. Deborah had also been coming up with mulling an idea about writing an article on the initiative to rename monuments, or how the movement to rename monuments was trickling into the space industry, particularly with renaming NASA's Stennis Space Center. And so we ended up putting those two things together and taking a look at NASA's response, the industry's response, and trying to put together a broader comprehensive view of how something that, as you mentioned in the intro, started as a national event and then quickly grew to nationwide and even international protests. It really felt like it touched just about everybody, especially in the US, and that included the space industry. And so we wanted to document that.
Sure. So you brought those two ideas together with the convergence of it. For our readers and our listeners overseas, Senator John Stennis was a U.S. Senator from Mississippi who, among other things, opposed the 1965 Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1968. And so that's the politician in question here. Deborah, I assume I had that right about John Stennis, correct?
Yes, yes, you did. And the one thing that happened as Caleb and I started to discuss this and started to call people was, as Caleb reminded me today, because this was on everyone's mind, because the nation was grappling with these issues, people really wanted to talk about it. And they were happy to go on the record and off the record and talk at length about what they felt like was happening and should happen and their part in it.
Was there any resistance or any company unwilling to comment that you said, wow, I'm surprised?
I think for the major companies and for publicly traded companies, any comments on any subject are more difficult. I found that even more so in something that we might want to talk about later, which was the diversity training executive order.
Right, yeah, and we will get into that. And there was great participation from the industry. How long did it take you to complete the interviews and the piece? Caleb, you want to go?
Yeah, I want to say it took us a couple of weeks. That's our usual turnaround for an article at Space News. I feel like this one was probably a 2 to 3 week assignment. And yeah, at that point, we had, between the interviews and material that was already publicly available, I mean, there was pages and pages of stuff. The article could have been twice as long, but for the sake of keeping readers engaged, we limited it to, I want to say it's around 2,000 words. I'd have to double check, but we kept it to our typical magazine length, roughly.
Yeah, that's about right, 2,000 words. And as you're reading it, you realize this thing could have been 10,000 words, given the way you guys were developing it. At the risk of sounding like Brian Lamb of C-SPAN, did you write this together? Did you edit each other? How do you guys collaborate on that?
I recall that we were discussing what we were learning as it was going, and then sharing what we had written with each other to read.
Okay. Caleb, is that your recollection of this?
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess that's your inner journalist. Even if
That's right. Well,
saying, if your mom says she loves you, get a second source.
Right. I've watched you in action long enough, you too. How would you describe, again, based on your exposure to it so far, how would you describe the level of diversity in the space and satellite industry in 2020, Deborah?
So Caleb and I were talking about this earlier, and it made me go back and think about the beginning of my career. Because in the late 80s, I was a Pentagon reporter. And in terms of gender diversity, it was very, very little. And I would go to defense conferences and very often be the only woman in certain panels or one of few
Yeah.
women at an entire event. So in that regard, I think we've made quite a bit of progress. And this may be different because I've only been doing the space reporting for about 12 years.
Mhm.
So I think space is more diverse in terms of gender than military reporting, than the military industry and conferences. But maybe
It's
Caleb has.
more diverse in terms of gender than the military.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
seems that way to me.
Yeah. Well, Caleb, taking it from the perspective of race, as an American of African ancestry, same thing. Have you seen some progress, or what would you describe as the level of diversity right now?
So yeah, I would say, now granted, I was a reporter covering the satellite and space industry for 7 years before joining Quilty Analytics about a month ago. So I don't have as much tenure as Deborah to look back on, but I would say that I really haven't seen that much change over the time period that I've been covering, from at least from the perspective of seeing more Black or African American members of the space industry. I do think that it actually has grown, and this is just my observation going to industry conferences, so it's not corroborated by numbers. I think Aviation Week does an annual report on the workforce where they quantify what the industry looks like. But my sense was that the industry has grown in some ways. I think it's more diverse. Just because of how international it is. I think as more countries get involved in space, you're seeing an increased number of badges and people from, be it Korea or Japan or the UAE or Brazil, and that is resulting in greater diversity in the industry. But if we were talking about the U.S. In particular, I don't think that it's an organic, so to speak, rising up of diversity. It's more so just the broader landscape.
Yeah, which by default you would expect that globally, right? Because we're a global industry and we're in so many countries. I mean, Nepal now has the space agency, so you would expect that. It's intriguing though why America hasn't moved that fast in your view. And you both point out in your piece that out of 350 astronauts from the United States, I believe only 14 were of African ancestry, were Black Americans, and only 3 of them, I think, Deborah, were women. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, it's been very slow. I was just listening to another podcast, The Space Race from American History Tellers, and it talked about the Mercury 13. Are you familiar with them? It was when the Mercury astronauts were selected.
Sure.
About 18 women went through the same physical and psychological training, and 13 passed with flying colors and were minor celebrities, but never selected by NASA. It reminds me of the lack of women flying in space. Reminds me of the lack of women as combat pilots for so long. I think there was a view that women were more fragile and needed to be protected.
Right. Yeah, you wonder the degree to which some of this is just cultural and has been persisted for so long that is almost hardwired into a society until society moves on it. Caleb, would you describe the reason as that primarily as what is commonly called today institutional racism?
When I look at the numbers, as you pointed out, it's 14 out of 350, and then you think about the demographics of the U.S., so the Black population is about 13% of the U.S. that tells you that if there was going to be a representative number of Black Americans as astronauts, you would want to have around, or you should by now have had around 40 or so astronauts, 40 or so African American astronauts. And
Yeah.
that hasn't happened. The reasons for that, like anybody will tell you, it's complex. I don't know if we have time to unpack the whole reason behind it. Certainly, the legacy of American racism has a lot to deal with, or to is certainly involved. I think also part of it is just perhaps even people not recognizing that deficit, like what I just mentioned. I think that I'll say there's once people realize that there's a gap, then we have to ask ourselves why it exists and what we're doing about it. And there's a lot in history that answers why that exists, from discrimination against Black Americans in voting and housing and education and in opportunity that results in a diminished access to jobs like becoming an astronaut. And then we can look forward to what we're doing now, or asking, are we changing any of those things, or have we just let them cement certain people in America at different stages in life and not actually have access to all that America has to offer?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's well said. And, as they say in meditation, or Buddhism, and until you're aware that you're suffering, you're not aware of it. So the first step is awareness. You have to be aware, and then you begin to analyze the conditions around which you haven't become enlightened yet. And there are a lot of them. You guys, I want to switch more to the commercial side, because these are great opportunities for all of us to come along on this ride, right? As that side of our industry expands pretty significantly. And you guys did some really nice reporting on Relativity Space, which is again, for our listeners out there who aren't inside the industry, it's a small launch vehicle company. They announced in July that they were going to hire I believe it was a diversity, equity, and inclusion program manager. They could have said DEI, and they probably will. That will build a workplace that drives, quote, its organizational values. First, what exactly is Relativity attempting to do here?
Yeah, for this one, part of what we did when we put together this article was we looked at, we sourced our information from a combination of interviews and statements that companies had put out, or company executives had put out. And for Relativity Space, this was one where they announced, I actually think it was on Twitter, that they were going to be making this diversity, equity, and inclusion hire. And so they were not a company that we spoke to directly, but we took note of the action that they were taking and included that in our overview of the response by the space industry as an example of a very fast-growing startup that was making sure that as they grew, they were growing in a way that was inclusive and representative, and so that they wouldn't look back and go, hey, we don't actually reflect America or our regions of America as much as we hope we would.
One thing that I would interject there, if I may, is that I'm noticing with the startups, which I have a lot more contact with because I'm on the West Coast in the San Francisco Bay Area, they want diversity, not simply to reflect the nation or their customers, but because they see the value in having many different viewpoints, people of many different backgrounds who might come at problems in different ways. And I think that they feel like to succeed, they have to cast a wide net in terms of hiring.
That's interesting, Deborah, because when you put it within that framework, or that proposition, what I interpret from that is that this is actually good for the organization. This feeds the need for an organization to be more creative, more flexible, to have more points of view for economic expression, for economic purposes as much as anything else.
Yes.
Is that, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
you know, it's,
exactly what I mean.
yeah. And Caleb, with the growth of the commercial sector, would you expect there to be more diversity going forward, given notions like the one, you know, Deborah just laid out? Are CEOs, in your view, beginning to pick up on this?
I think that what happened this summer between the deaths or killings of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, the outcry that started in Black America and then reached such a, you know, a critical point, or it got so loud that really everyone heard. And one of the things that I took note of was it seemed to me that more people were becoming aware of various difficulties within the Black community, or within just like Black experience in America. I think the CEO of Blue Origin mentioned how there was a woman at his church that had spoken with him about um, preparing her son to deal with police, realizing that you know his life could be in jeopardy depending on how he is perceived by the police, regardless of whether or not you know he's the victim or anything. And so that was something that I recall. I don't think that specific mention made it into our article, but he shared there an eye-opening experience that he is unlikely to have learned about if he had not had a personal conversation with a woman of color. And that gives me hope, because between what Deborah is finding with startups, recognizing that diversity is important for their overall robustness from day one, to larger companies that have been around for a decade or decades, learning now what it's like for everyone, not just basically majority culture in America. That does give me hope that we are on the right path. But it's obviously going to come down to whether or not this is something that has a short burn, or whether or not people make long-term lasting efforts to include change.
Right.
Because
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, that is the issue. And again, you know, as people realize it, maybe they will. And I always wondered, living in New York, why immigrants, for example, were so good at a lot of the things that they did. And a lot of it was because they're just being held to a higher standard because of opportunities that they couldn't have. And so the question is, you know, how do you work around that so that you have a more equitable society? And that's probably another show for us to talk through. But Deborah, I wanted to just, and I think you wanted to as well, revisit the issue of the renaming of the Stennis Space Center. You guys, I mean, the piece spends a good bit of time near the end regarding the naming of buildings and canceling. And so you reported on the effort afoot to rename the John C. Stennis Space Center. And I'd mentioned Senator Stennis's record on civil rights. Going forward, there's a larger issue of corporate culture to look at. Based on your reporting in July, is the current leadership in the industry equipped to deal with complexities like this? And frankly, should we start with renaming or not naming things and go somewhere else to have this discussion?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I don't really know. I don't feel like I can say whether the leadership in the industry is equipped to deal with that. I think that people in good faith are trying to deal with the complexities of diversity. And I noticed this recently as I was trying to talk to people about President Trump's executive order on diversity training. An executive order that said that certain types of diversity training were anti-American and that federal contractors could not conduct them. And as I called around, people did not want to speak on the record. And I just got the impression that they hoped that this would go away, or that they could fly under the radar and just continue what they were doing in terms of working toward diversity and inclusion, because they thought it was important and they thought it was good for their companies.
Right. Again, it goes back to that, what's good for the collective, right? That's so interesting. We're getting near the end here, unfortunately. Some can ask, maybe we can get some quick answers in, but Caleb, overall, is the industry out of step with the times? You quote Jeffrey Manber of Nanorex saying it's his fear that that this could be an industry that's moving behind the times. Is it your sense that the industry is out of step or getting in step, as you kind of described?
Yeah, it's another good question. I feel like so before I was breaking down, in order for you to have change, you first have to know why things are the way they are. You have to know basically how we got here, and then you have to know what you're going to do next. You could, for I guess use of a space space reference, if you're on a rocket and the rocket's already launched, then you'll know your trajectory based on where you were
Right.
just moments earlier. And so for the space industry, it's the same thing. I think space is a much younger pursuit than nation building or company building or any of those things. We've only, as a species, been in space since 1957, was it, with Sputnik?
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, space, it was born out of countries that were imperfect. And so the USSR and the United States both leaped into the stars with all of their problems and challenges. And going to space won't perfect us. So we have to realize that if we want space to really make the best of us, or to really be something that we look up to and say, like, we did our best, we have to realize some of the baggage that we're going to carry with us. And if we're not careful, then we won't include diversity. We will end up with things like a small percentage of astronauts that are Black or Hispanic or Asian, when we have large and growing members of those ethnic groups within the US. I think that the industry is now realizing what its past is, and how a past that is older than the space industry shapes it, and whether or not we want to continue to allow that past to guide us, or if we want to make something new. My hope and what I've seen so far is there's a desire to make something new and better.
So if I ask you, are we taking steps in the right direction, your answer would probably be yes.
My answer is yes, but it's something that you have to ask with every step.
Don't take it for granted.
Correct.
And well, your article certainly, gets us moving in the right direction. Deborah, last question and word over to you. As Caleb said, when you launch a rocket, or a jet starts to fly, so far as I can tell, there's no reverse gear on it. You have to keep going forward, and how you navigate at that point, again, as Caleb said, is up to us. Women have heard for a long time that you can only go so far so fast, and that's, you can say that that's a way to keep people from moving where they need to move quickly, or it is either that or a fact of the way we're moving, or the way we move in society. Do you subscribe to that with regard to the issue we're talking about now, which is space for all and diversity? Can you only go so far so fast, or can you just accelerate this thing?
Well, when I think of you can only go so far so fast, that seems like it would be more a relic of old space, of more established companies that move forward very carefully. New space seems to go forward very fast. So I'm hoping that with diversity and inclusion, it can move at the speed of new space, which we've got companies popping up every day and doing incredible things.
Yep. Well, I think that's a good way to end it. And they really are. So maybe one of those incredible things would be to read your article from Space News in July 13th titled How the Space Sector is Responding to the Killing of George Floyd, and allow that to be a primer on, a conversation that will certainly keep going. Deborah and Caleb, thanks so much for making the time to be here with me today.
Thank you,
Appreciate it.
Lou. It was a pleasure.
And that concludes my conversation with Caleb Henry and Deborah Werner. Join me next time as we continue this series. Thanks once again to the 20 under 35 cohort and SES for their financial support, and to our corporate members and the members of SSPI and its chapters. SSPI is the voice of the space and satellite professional. It is the world's largest nonprofit trade association for professionals, students, and others whose work, life, and study. And to learn more about our Better Satellite World narrative, and to hear more conversations like this one with Caleb Henry and Deborah Werner, go to bettersatelliteworld.com. And if you're not a member of SSPI and you just can't wait, go to sspi.org again. Student memberships, by the way, are free. Follow us on Twitter at SSPI, and check us out on LinkedIn and Facebook. For Space and Satellite Professionals International and our producer, Ana Gomez, I'm Lou Zaccarella. Let's make it a better satellite world. Take care, everybody.